Welcome, everyone. And for those of you live in Finland, good afternoon. For those of you joining from around the world, welcome to the Friday afternoon keynote for the We Love Games conference. I'm delighted to be giving this session. My name is Dicken. I'm Senior Director for the Applied AI team at Zynga. And I've been with Zynga for about 8 years now. Prior to that, I was based in Glasgow in Scotland. I've got 4 degrees in artificial intelligence. I did my PhD at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and that was specifically about AI for video games. And from that work, I moved over to San Francisco. I joined Zynga as a data scientist, and kind of haven't looked back over the last, next month it will be 8 years. Today, I want to talk to you about building for greatness. I want to talk to you about some of the things that I've learned recently over the last handful of years running the Applied AI group here. And I want to talk to you about what we call high performance teams. So to begin with, let's go ahead and define what we mean when we say a high performance team. I think I stole this definition from Wikipedia. There's a few out there, some of them are not great. But a high performance team is a concept within organization development, referring to teams, organizations, or virtual groups that are highly focused on their goals and that achieve superior business results. And that's kind of a bit of a stuffy definition and a little bit kind of, you know, who wouldn't think that they conform to that? So I want to get a little bit more specific, and I want to say that what I mean when I say high performing teams is a team that is able to kind of like enter a flow state together. And I know we use the term flow and we bandy it about quite a bit, but like when everybody on the team is grooving together and everything just feels in tune, that's what high performance means. When the team is better than the sum of its parts, that's another great indicator. And for anybody who's kind of had the opportunity to be part of this, high performance teams really just feel different. It feels different from kind of even when you enjoy your work, like enjoying the work, enjoying your co-workers, kind of, you know, being part of a cool environment is a great thing. It's also a little bit rare, but high performance kind of takes it one step beyond that into kind of everybody in the groove and getting things done just at an incredible kind of cadence. I'm really kind of delighted with how my teams come together, and I want in this session to kind of share some of the strategies that I think have contributed to our ability to kind of function at this high level. But first off, let me introduce my team. And our story starts in Toronto. I was visiting Toronto in March of 2019. And it turns out that visiting Toronto in March is a really bad idea. It was bitterly cold all the time that we were staying there. There'd been a storm come through. And it had been so bad, in fact, that one of the people who was on the trip with me, his flight had tried to land, I think, 3 different times at Toronto Airport. And kind of the weather had been bad enough that they'd kind of had to do kind of the oh no, we're not landing right now kind of thing, and yeah, it was just not great. And I'd been out to dinner with some folks, and I was headed over to meet up with some friends who weren't at Zynga. And I got, you know, as I was kind of standing up to head out from this dinner, just got a text from my boss that was like, "Hey, call me." And I was like, well, okay, you know, I'm headed, you know, I'm about to walk a few blocks, and I'm gonna kind of sit down and sit down with these friends and spend the rest of the night. So let me just give them a call while I'm walking. So trudging through kind of, you know, snow honestly thicker than in this photo. And we started talking about kind of what the future could look like. And at that time, I was running the central analytics group at Zynga. And we achieved some really impressive results with that team. We'd kind of reimagined our analytics stack. We'd worked with our engineering group to deploy something that we were pretty proud of. But we kept coming back to this idea of like, well, how can we make sure we don't end up out of position again? How can we kind of make sure that we're on the cutting edge of things? And as I walked through the snow, me and my boss, Alex, were talking about, you know, what R&D could look like and how we could set up for success to investigate some of the things that I'd been kind of talking to him about the way that I felt AI could work in the game space. You know, the opportunities that existed beyond some of the more low-hanging fruit, but kind of, you know, looking ahead maybe 10 years and seeing how we could explore the opportunities there and get there in 5. And pretty much, you know, I walked through the snow and I ended up stood outside of this diner where I was meeting my friends. And they're sat in a booth by the window and they can see that I'm here and I'm still on the phone, and they're like, why are you not coming inside? Why are you standing out in the cold? And the reason was, it was probably, you know, it was probably the most exciting conversation maybe of my life to date, certainly of my career to date. Because we were talking about this new team and we were talking about effectively a blank canvas and the opportunity to undertake something transformative for Zynga. And it was absolutely thrilling to consider what that might look like, but it was also intimidating, right? It was making me anxious because I had no idea how we were going to pull this off. But it was evident that the stakes were going to be really high. And not only were the stakes going to be really high, but the initial resourcing was going to be super low. You know, to begin with, we were 3 people. And, you know, the mission to kind of figure out what the next 10 years of AI for games was going to look like and get there faster was, and still is, a hell of a hill. And it became pretty obvious that we weren't going to be able to just slap a team together to do this. So I want to talk to you about the process by which we built that team, by which we run that team, and hopefully that provides some insights for you on, you know, how you can structure your teams, how you can think about leadership to unlock the potential for yourselves. So first off, the important thing is kind of finding that high performance. You know, it's all very well kind of being in a position where you kind of starting with this blank piece of paper, but how do we get to a place where high performance is a thing that we can do, right? First thing that I think is super important is actually start looking at what other organizations have done. Draw as much inspiration from them as possible. There's lots of research, there's lots of books on the topic. I'm going to have, at the end of this, I'm going to show a whole bunch of books that I do recommend. But a lot of organizations do want to talk about this kind of strategy stuff. There's lots of information about Amazon and Amazon's leadership principles, about Google X, about the Lockheed Skunk Works, which is kind of one of the kind of pinnacles of R&D in particular, but kind of this idea of kind of getting shit done in a fast-paced environment. Obviously, we're now talking about this from the Applied AI Zynga team, and, you know, going outside of the tech world and the corporate world, there's a lot of other kind of less obvious places to draw inspiration from. The 2 that I've cited here are kind of military doctrine and military books and culinary, actually, which is I guess a bit of a weird one. But I guess the more I've thought about this, the more it's like, well, anywhere where you kind of don't have a huge margin of error, where the stakes are pretty high, and you know, you might argue that the stakes are nowhere higher than in the military. But certainly like high-end fancy cooking, like, you know, the way that kitchens operate is also hugely kind of high pressure, low ability to fail. And the same is true in tech to an extent. These are places that you can draw inspiration from. But the real problem with a lot of how I see people talking about these institutions in particular is that it becomes dogma, right? The number of times that I have seen people on Twitter in particular posting about, well, Twitter does things this way, well, Amazon does things this way. Most leadership advice omits the context, and most of it is stuff that worked in a specific moment for a specific reason. And without that context, you can't necessarily gauge whether this is something that is going to work for you. So I think it's important that you kind of take a, you know, even in what I'm telling you, and I'm going to say this a few times through this session, take what you want, leave the rest. If it sounds like something that might be useful for you, adopt it. I've stolen from a variety of places. I've stolen from the Skunk Works. I've stolen from Amazon. You know, in the moment, in the right moment, somebody else's solve for this problem may well work for you. But that doesn't mean that you should just blindly follow those principles and that guidance. It also doesn't mean that you should just adopt something and then never reevaluate it. In the same way that the context is omitted from a lot of advice, your context is actually changing. You know, what works for 3 people doesn't work and didn't work for 10 people for us. We started out with some very blue sky projects, and we had to jam very hard in kind of almost like a hackathon mode. And that worked great for us. And then we kind of hit this period where things stopped working, and we eventually worked out it's because we shifted gear. We weren't in hackathon mode now. We were in kind of bring this thing to production mode. And that necessitated some changes about kind of how we thought about leadership, how we kind of whose advice we were following. Advice from the Skunk Works is very good for hackathon type stuff. Advice from kind of the Microsofts and the Amazons of the world is a lot better when you kind of shift gears and start to work in a more kind of deliberative way. The first thing that I think it's important to do is kind of sit down and define those principles. So in the Skunk Works, it's Kelly Johnson's 14 rules of the Skunk Works, which I encourage you to go find that document. It's out there. It's oddly specific in some places, but there are some really insightful ideas in that one. Same with Amazon's leadership principles. But the trick here is write down yours. Write down what works for you. And those values, those principles, actually making them explicit makes it easy for people to understand. It makes it easy for people to follow them. And I'm not going to tell you that's easy. That's actually a very hard thing. Figuring out what it is that you stand for as a leader, figuring out what the values are of the team and how you want that team to kind of be structured and operate, and articulating that in a concise way. That's tough. That's really tough. Doing your research into how other people have done it is definitely going to be something that's useful for kind of guiding the way. And another thing to keep in mind is that this, just because you're taking like a first swing at it, you don't need to get it right first time. This can be a living document. It can be something that you change over time, that you evolve and iterate on with the whole team, with everybody, because the sense of ownership has to be across the board. And the only way to get kind of buy-in is to get everybody on board if you want to change that document. But the critical thing here is that the values and principles of a team should really be pretty obvious. And if you want to make a change to those principles, it ought to not be something like you ought to introduce it and everybody go, yeah, okay, was that not in the document already? And you go, well, hey, let's add it to the document. Because if you are not in a place where everybody is aligned, you're probably not in a high performance world anyway. But certainly if people are not aligned about what the values and principles of the team are, then that's a problem. That's something that you need to be able to address and get alignment on. So defining this stuff up front feels like big overhead. It feels like a lot of work, but I can't tell you the extent to which it pays dividends down the line. This is mine. And again, your mileage may vary. I'm not suggesting you should just adopt this wholesale. My kind of first rule, people before projects or profits. My overall kind of thing here is that the project can fail, profits can be down, ROI can be low, but if we look after the people, we can take care of the rest. Team size less than or equal to 5 people. We'll talk about that a little bit a couple of slides from now, but this one's about kind of making sure that managers are actually giving their direct reports the time and attention that they need. Continuous check-in rather than annual performance review. We write this one down for our team primarily because Zynga actually doesn't work this way. We are an annual performance review with like a very optional kind of quarterly check-in, biannual kind of casual review, but the big kind of annual performance review happens around March time. Fundamentally, my belief is that if that annual performance review tells somebody something that is a surprise to them, then we've failed as leaders. And that's why this kind of part of the rules is really kind of pushing people to ensure that continuous check-in and regular feedback is provided. I really don't want to get into a world where we get to the end of the year and people are surprised. People need to know where they're at, what they're doing. And again, being very people first pays dividends. Rapid experimentation requires radical collaboration. Now, this one is a little bit more specific to us. Because of the nature of the work that we do, we need to actually do an awful lot of kind of experimentation and finding out whether the idea works as fast as possible. And we've kind of had varying success with that, honestly. It's like some of the ideas are so big that it takes a long time to get that kind of first pass at the experimentation. But the underlying thing here is that we're going to be working on top of each other. And as a result, both our processes and also our tools need to be geared up for very collaborative work style. We are on top of each other in code bases. We need to be taking infrastructure and ownership of infrastructure backwards and forwards and kind of passing stuff and information backwards and forwards. And as a result, we need to articulate that, we are rapid experimentation, we are radical collaboration. The next one, the fifth bullet point, is kind of my get out of jail free card, a little bit anyway. Basically, you have to acknowledge that we need flexibility, right? And this kind of comes back to that comment about context on the previous slide or a couple of slides ago. Like, if somebody quits, which has happened incredibly rarely on this team, but maybe we actually need to break that team size rule. Maybe we land in a world where one of the projects, like if it doesn't work, we all get shut down and laid off. Rule 5 is about kind of, okay, sometimes you're going to have to deviate from this, but you have to actually admit that you're deviating from it, right? Rules that get broken become like eroded and people stop paying attention to them. Like, rules have to be rules. This one says, okay, well, you can kind of bend the rules if you absolutely need to, but you actually have to say out loud why you need to. And that kind of gives us a bit of flexibility, and it gives us the option to kind of do what we need to do. And it's important that rule 5 is where it is, because rule 6 is absolutely cannot be broken. Nothing erodes trust on a team, in my experience, than leaders who are bullshitting the team. There are going to be times when you have to be less than transparent with the team. There are times when you don't want the team worrying about something, but in my experience, specific experience, the fastest way for me to disengage from a team was when the leaders were very obviously lying about what was happening with the team. Coming back and kind of ending up in a massive kind of emergency meeting with all the leads for 5 hours, and then coming out and saying everything was fine with the executive review they'd just come back from. Well, that's bullshit. And we can all smell it. And as soon as we smell it, trust is out the window. So that's the one that in my list, that's the one that you cannot break. I would encourage that one to be adopted by everyone. But hey, maybe your team is different. I'm not here, I'm not selling dogma. I'm telling you what works for us. Decision-making is also something to get real crisp on up front. How decisions get made, who makes decisions, and how we even think about decisions. I see teams get really hung up on stuff that they can't necessarily answer, but that doesn't necessarily matter. And Jeff Bezos has a framing of type 1 and type 2 decisions. Type 1 decisions are things that we can back out of. They're things that we can make a choice, we can go and we can see what happens. And if we need to reevaluate, we can. Type 2 decisions are effectively like one-way doors. We're going to make a choice here, and we can't do anything about that choice. Type 2 decisions you need to get right. You need to get that right first time, hopefully. Type 1 decisions, like if you don't get it right, then we can reassess, we can come back. A great example of this is a couple of months ago, we started feeling like we had too many meetings on our calendar. We had too many team meetings and too many meetings that we were requiring everybody to be at. And probably we spent too long kind of trying to decide what we were going to do about that. That's clearly a type 1 decision, right? You can just cross some stuff off the calendar and be like, cool, we're not having that meeting, we're not having that meeting. And 3 weeks from now, if everybody's freaking out, then okay, I guess we needed those meetings and we can put them back on. We're going to talk about hiring in a couple of slides here. That's definitely a type 2 decision. You hire somebody, you're stuck with them for a while, particularly in corporate America. I mean, different countries have different labor laws. Maybe you have an opportunity to kind of back out of those decisions a little bit more easily. For me, there is no decision in kind of my whole kind of career that matters more than a hiring decision. Clearly, that's a type 2 decision. A lot of teams also get bogged down in what's called bike shedding. So bike shedding is a term from a story about, I think it was a nuclear power plant that was being built, and the kind of design process for that nuclear power plant. Turns out building a nuclear power plant, really hard. Nobody really wants to get into the nitty-gritty of that. But having long drawn out conversations about where the bike sheds should be positioned is easy. Everybody's got an opinion about that. And I think the story might be apocryphal, but the kind of underlying moral is that it's really easy to get caught up in like things that are addressable rather than things that are important. And if you kind of spend your time on the trivialities, then some of those hard decisions will never get made. And that's a problem as well. So you've got to focus on what matters and only what matters, right? And then find a decision-making strategy that works for you as a team. Broadly, there are kind of 3 decision-making strategies. There's I decide. So that's a wee bit dictatorial. There's we discuss and we decide, which is very kind of participatory democracy kind of model. I don't really love either of those, honestly. I generally don't have, particularly these days, I don't have enough information about a problem. If somebody brings me a problem, I'm going to have a lot of questions because I'm not as deep in the weeds as I used to be. And I need a lot more perspective and points of view. So I decide isn't going to work because I'm probably going to decide wrong. On the other hand, at the other extreme, we discuss and then we decide. Well, in general, like collective decisions tend to kind of become a little bit, in my experience, become a little bit kind of regression to the mean. And equally, from a leadership point of view, there's going to be times when you can't share some of the perspective or points of view of like what's happening elsewhere in the company or elsewhere with the project, or some feedback that a client gave you that, you know, is not really in a format where it can be shared with everybody, but has influence on a decision. We discuss, I decide is kind of the model that we've found works. I want input from everybody, but ultimately the buck is going to stop with whoever the decision maker in that moment is. It doesn't have to be me specifically, but somebody needs to be on the hook. And somebody needs to be accountable, right? When we think about kind of group decisions, it's very easy for everybody to be like, well, we all said. The buck has to stop somewhere. And to that point, it's actually important to make sure that the decisions escalate to the appropriate level. Appropriate level is super subjective, and it takes a while to kind of dial in what that level is. But in general, with a high-performing team, you want that team to be empowered. You want them to be kind of making decisions as best they can. And then you need to be able to articulate where those guardrails are and kind of what decisions do need to escalate. So anything that impacts roadmap, impacts kind of stakeholder relations, that usually gets escalated to my level. Anything that's kind of more code driven and kind of more about the tactical elements of the project, that will stay kind of down at my leads level, or maybe even at the contributor level. It's a hard balance to strike, but the more that you kind of feel that out with the team, the more that you're going to kind of be able to empower people. And again, high performance is about empowerment, right? It's about kind of people being in the groove, making the decisions, growing, but also getting those decisions right. But what happens when those decisions are wrong? And this is kind of like as I put this slide deck together, this slide has kind of bounced around a bit. And the reason for that is that I think this might be the most important slide in this session. Making space for people to fail is important. We are, all of us, human, flawed. Nobody's going to get everything right kind of 100% of the time. Even, you know, I don't even pretend to. I'd probably say, I don't know, more often than I give a straight answer to my team. But we work through and we figure it out, and it's okay for people to not know, and it's okay for people to be wrong. But they need to be safe when they're wrong. They need to feel like there's not going to be, you know, when I say there's no repercussions, I mean there's no, you know, people are not going to be judged. They're not going to be teased. They're not, you know, it's, well, sometimes they get teased. But the point is, it's not going to be a problem. Because if you get to a place where having an opinion that's wrong, or even not aligned with the group, is something that is like forbidden, then that becomes a major problem. And this idea of psychological safety is core to high-performing teams. When people feel safe, they perform better. You find out about problems sooner because nobody's trying to like hide that there's a problem because they're worried about the repercussions. And you get better feedback. Like, you actually get told, hey, the way this is running doesn't feel great to me, and we can sit down. And that's not a commitment necessarily that we're going to change it. but it is a commitment to at least a discussion about like, well, okay, why, how could we address it? What does that in turn compromise? And maybe we can find a better way of doing things. And kind of providing a psychologically safe environment is, giving people the space to fail counterintuitively makes them so much less likely to fail, because they get out of bad habits that kind of lead into these kind of failure states. But it has to be genuinely safe, right? It has to actually be okay for people to push back. It has to be okay for people to say no or be wrong. And if you're running a team where that's true, like you're already halfway there to success anyway. But let's imagine that you've kind of set up your team or kind of adopted new strategies and you've kind of landed in a world where you feel like you're on the cusp of high performance. The big thing is going to be maintaining that. Like I said, we had a real problem kind of transitioning effectively through a gear change, and we almost lost it. Honestly, we got real spicy. Kind of early last year, probably. There was a period where I was pretty sure that the lifespan of the team was measured in days or weeks. We were really struggling to engage with executives. We were not firing on all cylinders, and we were able to make some changes and kind of recapture that kind of high performance state again. But effectively, we're talking about kind of continuing to ride a wave. And when you're surfing and you're riding the wave, it's real easy to fall off. So when you talk about maintaining that high performance, if you told me 5 years ago that I would be standing here giving you a slide about why production is super important, I would probably have laughed at you. But production actually is one of the most vital support roles you can have. When we think about high performance, we think about accountability. We think about not just accountability, but transparency. Task tracking allows us to hold each other accountable, to kind of see where we are, see where things are going off track, and not in a finger pointing way, but in a, okay, this bit is taking longer or is proving to be harder than we thought. And we can see that and we can move resources around. People can jump in and help. But we can't do that without solid production. So that's where kind of we start with this. Road mapping, we can have a different conversation about waterfall versus agile. And functioning in corporate America means some sort of wagile these days, because it turns out that executives want some sort of notion of when deliverables are coming and what that roadmap is going to look like to get there. But making that an inclusive process and making it something that people participate in actually is another way of helping them feel empowered, because you're not telling them what they're going to do. They're kind of working out what they need to do, and they've helped plan that. And when we do that, again, it's time away from like the coal face in a way. Bringing a bunch of data scientists and engineers to sit in roadmap meetings might not feel like the best use of their time all the time. But when you do it, and when you get them involved, and you get them involved in kind of the speccing and the road mapping and kind of, hey, is this deadline reasonable? Or, those kinds of questions, they actually start to really feel empowered to do their job. And on the kind of flip side of that, asking for feedback through retrospectives is super, super useful. Shouldn't press that button. It's actually a way of informing better process. Hearing from people what worked, what didn't, it gives them an opportunity to feel heard. And like, realistically, not every piece of feedback that comes up is addressable. Not everything can be taken on, and some things, unfortunately, are the way they are. One thing that has come up for us a couple of times is client relations and the way that we interface with our stakeholders. And unfortunately, that's more governed by the stakeholders and by the kind of corporate structure of Zynga outside of our team, which means that we can't necessarily just make our own rules around that, which is unfortunate. And it has been a point of feedback a couple of times, but it's something that we can talk about. It's something we can try to find a different solution for. But ultimately, at least knowing it's a problem is useful. Growth and hiring. So let's imagine that you're rolling and you're in the zone. The single biggest thing that can fuck that up is adding new people. One bad hire is the quickest way to derail a team. And it's important, right? You can't say, well, we're never hiring. But also, you've got to be very intentional about that hiring. And you've got to hire to complement the team that you have already. You can't just kind of hire in a vacuum. I could go on a half-hour soliloquy about kind of interview process and some of the things that we've tried and are trying around that. But when I say hire to complement the existing team, I think the kind of big takeaway is making sure that as much of the team is part of that process as possible. There's kind of a negative connotation to the term culture fit, but the kind of corresponding more positive reframing is values alignment. You've got to make sure that the people that you're bringing in not only are technically competent, but are going to be kind of positive additions to effectively the vibe, to this idea of high performance. Because if they're going to introduce friction, then they might not, you can be as technically competent as you want, but the friction that you introduce across the team, if you do introduce friction, is trading off against that technical competence. And another thing to kind of call out here is that, certainly in my world, by the time I have a strong enough justification to kind of convince the powers that be that I ought to be hiring, we're way too late. And I suspect that's true for most teams. Like, you have to have an acute pain point to justify hiring talent. But that means that you've got an acute pain point, and then you've got potentially, could be as much as 6 months before you've actually kind of brought somebody in, ramped them up, and addressed the pain point. So when we think about kind of growth and hiring, like, plan ahead. And the next couple of slides are going to be a little bit about kind of planning ahead, but talent pipeline in particular is vital. So for example, you could go out to a conference in Finland and present a whole spiel about how your team operates, because you know that about 6 months from now, you've kind of got half an idea that you're going to want to staff up a pod in Europe, for example. So developing a talent pipeline is useful. Planting those seeds, making sure that you're priming the pump, because the day you are approved for hiring, your team is already struggling, and like, you need to get that new person in as fast as possible, whilst making sure that they are absolutely the right fit. And that's not an easy ask. So if we're bringing new people in, we need to think about how we're structured. Now, I told you on the Dicken's rules slide that my personal rule is 5 directs as a hard maximum. I am fairly adamant that everybody should get a one-on-one with their manager on a weekly basis. That doesn't scale. And that's kind of where that rule comes from. That comes from this need to give people very personalized, very tailored attention, and be invested in them as a person, be invested in their career. One-on-one time should not really be bogged down in like what tasks have you accomplished, because that stuff gets handled at production level. How are you feeling? What's going on in your life? How are you feeling about your career growth? How are you feeling about the way that you're skilling up? These are great one-on-one questions. And it's very easy, particularly as that number grows past 5, for those to get kind of overlooked. So the next thing is that if we've got a hard limit of 5 directs and we're thinking about growing, we need to be thinking about the future. We need to be thinking about what that org structure is going to look like. What is it going to look like in 6 months? What's it going to look like in 12 months? What's it going to look like in 2 years? If we need this 5 direct structure, that starts to introduce the idea that, well, who's going to, as we grow, how are we going to conform to that? Well, chances are we need kind of a new layer of leads or managers, and those people probably are in the organization today. So how do you start prepping them? How do you kind of work ahead and start thinking about, like, how do we identify those people? And then how can we get them into position? Because the whole point here across the board really is when we're talking about high performance management, we're trying to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is today. So who in your organization could you imagine being, running a small team with 3 people? And how can you start grooming them towards that today? One of the things that we do is we lean pretty heavily on internships anyway. The nature of our R&D work is that there's an awful lot of kind of talent in academia and a little bit less in the industry. So we bring in interns for kind of summer paid internships. And that's a great opportunity to kind of start trialing people for management. An intern for 3 months is not, hey, you're in charge of this person's career. So these are the kinds of strategies that you can use to kind of prime the pump a little bit. And the real question is kind of how can you make yourself redundant in 6 to 12 months? How can your team and especially your leads grow to take over chunks of your role? Because that's the only way that you are able to scale towards additional initiatives, towards bigger and more impactful value across, the broader organization. All of that requires some amount of personal growth. In general, when we talk about high performers, we're talking about people who are way outside their comfort zone, and we're pushing them hard on new things. But that alone might not be enough. So that's where kind of coaching and mentorship kind of steps in and fills the gap. It's important to understand the difference between kind of mentorship and coaching. Mentorship generally is people who've previously been in that same situation and can provide insight based on their actual expertise. Coaching is a different beast altogether. Coaches generally haven't been in that same situation, and they don't necessarily have the same technical expertise, but what they are good at is asking questions. They're good at kind of teasing information out from people and helping them to ask the questions that they need in order to get to the answers that are kind of sometimes right in front of them. So, I mean, it doesn't break out this cleanly, but you could imagine mentorship for technical skills, coaching for kind of more softer foundational skills. It's not that clean. It really isn't that clean. But that might be a framing that helps you understand when one is more appropriate than the other. And this is kind of the thing that I want to wrap up on here, which is kind of culture. I've used the term a couple of times. I've tried to avoid it as much as I can because culture is an output. It's not an input. So I love this quote from Ben Horowitz in the book, What You Do Is Who You Are. It's one of the ones that I'll be recommending at the end of the session. Your culture is how your company makes decisions when you're not there. It's the set of assumptions your employees use to resolve the problems they face every day. It's how they behave when no one is looking. And a lot of what we've talked about to date in this session is about that. Establishing values, establishing principles, understanding the process by which decisions are made, creating an environment where people feel safe. All of that kind of feeds into this notion of culture. And I'm sick and really fucking tired of hearing these think pieces about culture being, oh, let's organize some happy hours. If we can get everybody back in the office, it's going to generate good culture. No, it's not. Culture happens when people trust and value their co-workers. They want to hang out with them. They want to spend time and do things in their off hours because they actually like and engage with these people. We're chasing our tails, getting lost, trying to replicate the symptoms of culture rather than looking at the root cause. So when we talk about culture, please define it for yourselves. Maybe it is, hey, we're going to set a culture where everybody, wind down Wednesdays and we're going to hang out on a Wednesday. Maybe it's not. High performance teams increasingly, I find, need weird rituals. They need this sense of identity. That's part of their expression. So for us, it's a Spotify playlist every Friday. And our engineering manager sets up a playlist, sets a theme, posts it on Slack, and everybody can contribute to it, and everybody's bopping along to the same playlist all day. We have a Minecraft server that we don't use so much, but it allows us to hang out and do stuff. Culture isn't one size fits all, but it is what happens when the team actually is vibing well. That is an important distinction because you can throw as many happy hours, you can throw as many board game nights. It's not going to solve your culture problems if the fundamental problem is people don't trust each other or value each other or respect each other. All right, I'm coming in for a landing here, and I think I'm over time, so I'm going to try to go fast. I started out this session by telling you our kind of founding story, and I think it's only fair to kind of close out by telling you what happened next. We were 3 people, and we got away from everybody. We literally went and sat in the basement of our San Francisco office, and we built some, I'm biased, but I would call it incredible technology. We built technology that would allow us to personalize a game on a per player basis, to change fundamentally what each person's game experience would be like, and to do that in a very intentional, data-driven way. The game is called Spell Forest. It's available today on iOS and Android. It's not great. By the time we shipped, we were 6 people, 3 data scientists and 3 engineers. That's not a great team for building a game, but we got it done. We also filed 8 patents on that technology, which is one of the reasons that I'm allowed to tell you like the technology even exists. 3 of those patents have already been approved. We're expecting the others soon. But this allowed us to kind of really think about what the future of AI and games was going to look like. And then we started thinking about, well, how do we bring this to the rest of the company? How do we get this to something that can have impact across the $13 billion studio that we operate in, rather than 6 people sat in the basement of the office? And we did a lot of work last year with Harry Potter Puzzles and Spells. Can't talk about that work, but we've now got features in that game that would not have been possible, according to the game team, without our technology. And more recently, I don't have a good graphic for this, but we're now working with our publishing organization, and we are working on things like advertising and user acquisition and things that will actually scale across the entire portfolio. And we're still 10 people, 12 people. And, that is a huge opportunity for us. And that is creating a world where 12 people are having an outsized impact across this massive kind of corporation. And I believe fundamentally that the things that I've told you about today are the reason why. So let's summarize. Yeah, this worked for us. We got lucky. We got real lucky. And it's hard to actually detangle what made things work versus like what was just going to work. And I kind of, in the spirit of not having all the answers, like there's some stuff we had to learn the hard way. Like, we came real close to losing it all and maybe even being laid off. But we pulled it back and we got back on track. I've said it multiple times and I want to reiterate it. Just because it worked for us doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But the questions that we asked and the way that we approached it probably will allow you to get to your own answers. And that's really important. I think the big takeaway from the last 3.5 years is that, like, successful leadership, you actually have to work at. You don't get to just show up and go, hey, I'm the boss. It's a huge responsibility, and it's something that really, if you don't kind of really bring your whole self and authentically live your values, as they say, nobody else is going to, pretending to be something that you're not is a great way to get everybody around you pretending to be something that they're not. And none of that sets you up for success. But actually kind of approaching this properly will really allow you to unlock your team's potential. I wouldn't be able to give this talk if we didn't have just an incredible group of people running the Applied AI team. Every day I'm blown away that I get to work with these folks and kind of build out this team. And the talent is absolutely first rate. I'm also super thankful to Keith Fuller, who has been my coach for the last couple of years. He's been a friend for a lot longer. But seriously, Keith does this for a living. I would certainly recommend any of you reach out to him. He's at some producer on Twitter. He's been a lifesaver for me. He can probably do the same for you. And over the course of my journey, I've just benefited from so many mentors that I actually can't list them all out on a slide. But this is what it takes. It takes a village, and we're off to the races now. I said I would give you some further reading. These are amazing books. I would recommend each and every one of them. Loon shots for R&D stuff. Working backwards for cribbing for Amazon. The Ben Horowitz, What You Do Is Who You Are, is an incredible culture book. Just generally, if you want to get better at this stuff, this is what you should start out reading, and by no means is this where you stop. And get in touch. I'm pretty sure it's about 3 a.m., so I'm pre-recording this session and I'm probably not going to be around live. So sorry about that, but I will be around the Discord throughout my Friday, which will be your Friday evening, and through the weekend. Track me down. I'm Luke Dicken. I'm easy to find. I'm also on Twitter. You can find me at Luke D. I would love to hear from anybody who's got questions. Fire them over. Thank you so much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference.